Thanks very much, Sheila. It's such a considerable pleasure to be here at this event in the Fish Trap tonight and have such a great turnout. The very first thing I should do is to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which the Performing Arts Centre is built, the Mandurah people of the Noongar Nation, and to really acknowledge the specialness of this site that's been expressed by this wonderful building on this great site. Very first, thanks very much for their consent. Tonight, this is the final event in the Writers on the Road series. We've had 4 events in the Performing Arts Centre today. 2 workshops with James Foley, a wonderful illustrator with kids, and over 40 kids took part in that today. And then the wonderful pyjama party with readings from writers, 350 to 400 kids, and their parents, delighting in our culture, our literature in the Boardwalk Theatre. And the ultimate event tonight, for a completely different audience, yourselves, is this event tonight. I have to acknowledge the support of the City of Mandurah Libraries, who have been a key partner in developing this event, all 4 events today. So thanks very much to Shantae and to Kathy Poozy and to Tina for your support in making this happen, and to John for allowing your team to be involved with us. But that's enough of the introductions. This event is really here to introduce and to celebrate Bernice Barry and her wonderful book on Georgiana Molloy. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And the green light's on and it sounds as if everything's working. So thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you this evening. It's fantastic to see so many people here. And a special welcome to the 1 or 2 people who are still wearing their pyjamas. So well done. Georgiana Molloy is known to most people these days as a botanist, but there's actually much more to her story than that. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a friend, a settler. And all those things mean that there are many reasons why people are interested in her story. When I talk to people who've read the book, it continues to be very evident to me that people come to her story for lots and lots of different reasons. And that means that there are people here this evening who may be here because they're interested in the botany. You might be someone who's fascinated by the history. I know that there are people who want to hear a little bit about the actual writing of the book, because I know it's not a typical biography. And I also know that there are people who want to hear something about my experience of self-publishing. And that's the interest that brought you here today. Well, I'm going to try and cover all those things in 35, maybe 40 minutes. And for someone who finds it difficult to be short-winded about absolutely anything, that is a very tall order, but I am going to have a try at that. So I've been doing this research into Georgiana's life for 11 years, and I started writing the book sometime in 2011. And it really only occurred to me for the first time a few weeks ago that her life was a life lived in gardens. Wherever Georgiana went, she was fortunate in having gardens around her. Wherever she lived, there was a garden. And to begin with, that experience that she had was formal gardens. They were planned, they were planted, they were designed by men and women. And that was really her first experience. So I suppose to begin with, it was gardening and it was horticulture. Even when she was at school in London, this is Kensington Square. The photograph was taken about a year ago. But the school was on Kensington Square in London, and behind the school was an enormous garden, certainly by British standards, by London standards. And in front of the school was Kensington Square. So wherever her window was in that building at school, when she was a young woman, she looked out onto beautiful, planned, formal gardens. But there was another ingredient for Georgiana in that she was very fortunate, and that was that wherever she was, as well as a formal planned garden, it always seemed that just beyond that garden there was a beautiful natural wilderness. This is a photograph that was taken of Crosby Lodge the home where she grew up until she was a teenager. And you can see that although the formal garden is actually just out of shot at the bottom of the photograph, but you can see that around the family home there was the beginning of an expanse of the wilderness that was Cumberland, now called Cumbria. And when she moved on to places like Scotland, this is taken at the Gairloch, where she was staying in Roseneath just before she came to Western Australia, the natural environment around her, as well as the gardens, there was a beautiful garden at Keppoch House, but as well as that, there was a very wide range of habitats. There were heathered mountains, there was a coastal shore, there were rivers, there was the loch, there were wild woodland areas. So it was a very, very good background, really, for someone who was going to end up very shortly in one of the most incredible, diverse ecological hotspots in the world. Of course, she didn't know that at the time when she first arrived here. But the next experience that she had when she came to Western Australia was Augusta. And we took this photograph not just in Augusta where the actual first settlement was, because they cleared that very quickly. That was the first thing they did. But this photograph was taken just around the bend of the river. And I took this because I think it shows us quite well what the edge of the river would have been like when they first arrived in Augusta at that time. There were rocks there and it was quite flat, but the first thing they had to do was clear the land. They put their tent, the tent where she had her first baby, and where the first baby died after 12 days. But they put the tent and they started to clear the land, and they began to try and create a life for themselves there. It was a very, very different kind of environment. She'd been dreaming about having a garden of her own in the new colony. She thought she'd be in Perth, and she ended up further south. But the first planting wasn't for flowers, it was for food. And when you bear in mind that the first thing they had to do was clear before they could even plant the seeds to grow the vegetables to get the food, and the trees that they were trying to cut down, it was taking 2 men a week to cut a tree down, get rid of the roots, cut it up, and move it out of the way. And you may already know that in that first year, the settlers in Augusta very nearly starved. I mean, literally starved. Partly because it took them so long to cultivate the land, and also because the government stores failed to arrive on the ship that was supposed to come and give them their supplies. So the first year for Georgiana in this area, which is where their first block of land was by the Blackwood River in Augusta, the first priority was growing food. And in that first period in Augusta, she was there for 10 years, but certainly for most of the time that she was there, her days were very full from before dawn until late into the evening. And I don't really know how she ever found time for botany, frankly. There were pulls on her time from all directions. She once called herself the servant of all works. The first thing really was the domestic jobs, the jobs of the mother and the wife. And that was really about putting food on the table 3 times a day for her children, for her family. And when there was nothing, when there were no crops, that was a very tall order. So she was churning the butter for milk. She made all their own clothes. She hated sewing, but she had to do the dressmaking. She made clothes for the servants as well. She even, at one time, was making the straw hats that they wore when they worked out in the paddocks in the summer. At Christmas, when they killed a pig, she said she was up to her elbows in pig fat, and she was making 2 enormous plum puddings at a time. I think probably not what I would think of as a plum pudding now, probably what my mum used to call a suet pudding, because that would involve the pig fat. I don't know a lot about that because I'm vegetarian, but that's what I think she was talking about. So that was the domestic jobs. And then, unusually for a woman who came from her background, there were the farm jobs. She was feeding the pigs. She was milking the cow. She was digging potatoes. She was planting vegetables. And those were the sorts of jobs that, when she was living at home in Britain, those were the sorts of jobs that were done by the very lowest of the servants that her family had. You know, the cowherd, the milkmaid, the farmhand. Feeding the pigs was something that she probably hadn't been expecting to be doing when she came to Western Australia. And then another pull on her time, which was quite frequent, was when John Molloy, her husband, was away, because he was the government resident, which was a sort of quasi-ministerial role. He was the representative of the government in that part of the colony. And he was often away for weeks, sometimes for months. And when he was away, she had to take on his job as well. So in the evenings, by her oil lamp, when she finally got some time indoors, she'd be dealing with the correspondence. She'd be trying to sort out disputes that were happening between the other settlers. There was a lot of cows getting through fences and eating people's crops, and disagreements about wandering livestock. She was doling out the rations, weighing flour, sorting out the rum that had to be given out to the settlers from the government store. And when there was any time available, that was when she did the botany. And it actually meant, as you can imagine, if you can even try and think about what her day was like, that there wasn't a lot of time for botany. She would often go weeks, even months, without doing anything to do with her botany. And it did mean, I think, that sometimes the domestic jobs they went by the way, so that she could actually get out and do some botanizing. Her life changed. If you're here this evening, you probably know that her life changed when she received a request from Captain James Mangles to collect for him, to collect on his behalf. And what happened was that from being a real amateur, she really began to take things much more seriously. And she actually became, over a period of time, obsessed and much more knowledgeable about the botany of the area around her. It took her quite a long time to realize how amazing the indigenous plants were around her, because to begin with, most of them were actually quite small compared with the plants that she was used to from when she'd been in Britain. I think almost certainly the first native orchid that she would have seen is the white bunny orchid. That's the one that we always watch out for after the first rains, and given the time of year that the settlers landed, that would be the first one that she saw. It's very, very small, but it's always the first one to come about a week after the first heavy rain. And this photograph was taken in Augusta at the time of year soon after the settlers landed. Her collections of dried flowers and the seeds that she collected, and some other kinds of plants that she put together in the Hortus Siccus, as it was called, for Captain Mangles, those were sent back to him in Britain. He's often talked about as a botanist, but he was actually a collector. He was a sort of middleman. He collected from the collectors and then sent the seeds and the dried specimens on to other people. The specimens went particularly to the botanists who were wanting to find out more about these amazing plants from the other side of the world, and the seeds went to the growers, often the growers and the gardeners of the very wealthiest people, including royalty, because they wanted to be the first to grow on these new exotic, incredible species in their very expensive greenhouses and basically show off about the incredible plants that they were able to grow. And her specimens now are held, some of them in the herbarium at Kew Gardens near London. And you can see them if you make arrangements to go. They will allow you to have a look at the specimens. I chose this one to show you. It isn't in the book. It's a smaller specimen from the Acacia extensa, which is in the book, the wiry wattle. And I just think for me this is a particularly poignant one because it's so tiny. And it just feels for me as if there's a direct connection between the woman who was walking out on a very hot day with a baby on her hip and a little one walking along her side. She'd moved up to Bustleton by then. It was known as the Vass at that time. She picked the very bright yellow wattle. She dried it. She did all that she needed to do to prepare it. She sent it to Captain Mangles. And then it actually had quite a long journey over the next 20 or 30 years, and it ended up in Kew Herbarium. That's a longer story than I haven't got time for. But I think that tiny little specimen for me is a real It's almost like a thread through time, and a very poignant one for Georgiana's botanical collections. Turn over. It's worth remembering that she was collecting for a long time. She had a wildflower dried collection when she arrived, so from when she was a young woman. But her serious botanical collecting for James Mangles really only lasted for 6 years, the last 6 years of her life. There were 3 collections. The first one, which was mainly plants from Augusta, that has been lost, to the best of my knowledge. That's my researchers found that it has been lost. And then there are 2 other collections. A large number of her specimens are in Kew Herbarium, but a lot of people don't realize that there are also some in the herbarium of Cambridge University in the UK. This is one of my favorites from Cambridge. I've only recently been allowed to have access to this photograph, and it's a favorite, not just because I think it visually looks beautiful. She was very adept at displaying the plants botanically as they needed to be shown for the botanists to see what they needed to see, but she also was able to make them look beautiful in the way that she displayed them. But this is the Drosera pallida, and I don't know how many people do have some botanical knowledge, but the Drosera it's one of my favorite plants, and it's actually in flower at the moment in the garden around the house at home. And it's a, I can't think of the word. Sorry? It's a sundew, but it's not parasitic, it's insectivorous. Yes, it's insectivorous. So all those gorgeous little spiky things, I always thought that it uses them to pull itself up. You know, it climbs up grass trees and things like that. But it isn't. Those little things are sticky because they get the insects and then they devour them. And the petals are just there, the beautiful white petals are just there to attract the insects to the little sticky things that you can see that appear along the stem. So she was in Australia for 13 years. She was collecting for the last 6 years of her life. In that 13 years, she had 7 pregnancies and 1 miscarriage. She had 5 surviving daughters and 2 children who died. The little girl who died in the tent on the beach in Augusta in the first few days of arriving, and then her little boy, her only son, drowned in the well in Augusta. And very sadly, the evidence suggests, I go cold when I tell this story, but the evidence suggests that he was probably still alive when they took him out of the well, and there was no doctor available. The doctor wasn't in Augusta at the time. And for the second time in her life, she didn't know what to do. She had a dying child in her arms, and she just didn't know what to do. So a very tragic story, as well as a very interesting and wonderful story. The end of her life, she spent the last 3 months bedridden in the house when they'd moved up to Bustleton in around 1839. And she had terrible problems each time she gave birth to a child. She knew that those problems were going to happen, and when she gave birth to the last child, little Georgiana, she didn't recover. For the first time, she failed to recover, and she was, the last 3 months of her life, bedridden, but she was still obsessed with trying to get the seeds of 2 particular plants successfully to Captain Mangles. The first one was the Noitsia floribunda, the West Australian Christmas tree, and the second one was the Kingia australis, one of my favorite plants, not least because it lives to such an incredible age. And this photograph was taken in an amazing grove of Kingia on Molloy Island. So given that some of these very tall plants are probably 1,000 years old, maybe, given the rate of their growth, she certainly would have seen these plants, which is another one of those wonderful links in history that really fascinates me. The Noitsia floribunda also is a very poignant story because it was the last seeds that she was trying to collect in a successful way for them to be grown on. And the Wadandi people believe, I'm told, that the Noitsia is the last resting place of a person's spirit after they die, before the spirit moves on out to the ocean. So that's a sort of very quick summary of Georgiana's life. It's a very thick book, so you'll understand it's a very quick summary. But a little bit about the writing of the book now, and some of the decisions and thoughts about that. There were a lot of real practical difficulties in the writing of the book. One of them, obviously, was that a lot of the things I needed to see and a lot of the texts I wanted to look at were on the other side of the world. And there's a certain amount you can do on that by getting help from kind people who live near London. And there's a great deal that you can do using the internet and getting hold of digital copies and digital photographs. One of the particular difficulties was to do with the texts themselves. I'll show you an example. I'm not expecting you for a moment to be able to even try to work out what it says, but 19th century writing can often be really difficult to decipher at the best of times. When it's cross-written like this, it can be almost impossible. The cross-writing, I'm told by quite a few people, actually went on even into the 1900s, and it was a way of saving on paper. For some people, it was a way of saving on weight and postage, but in the settlement, where paper was such a precious item, it was a way of saving space. So they would have a sheet of paper, write across it one way, and then when it was used up, they would turn it round and write across it the other way. Between us, Mike, my husband and I, and a few other friends who helped, I'd hate to think how many hours we spent transcribing documents. Quite a few of them have been transcribed before and quoted at length in previous biographies, but I discovered fairly quickly that it really wasn't a good idea to simply rely on those for a number of reasons. One was that sometimes even the best transcribers can simply miss out a line, and when you look at that, you can understand why. Another thing is that sometimes they would mistranscribe a word, and occasionally that can be quite important. An example would be in one of the biographies, Georgiana had written in a letter to her mother, I think. Well, in the biography it said she'd written, "The natives are very strange." But when I looked at the original, which is what I decided to do, to go back to the letters themselves and retranscribe, I found that what it actually said wasn't "the natives are very strange," it was "the natives are very savage." Now, I think probably the transcriber hadn't just mistranscribed the word. It was the thinking that perhaps thinking of the word savage in a way that some young people might use it now to mean aggressive and fierce. But Georgiana was using it in the original sense of the word, the French word sauvage, which basically means very, very natural, very unspoilt, very part of the environment. And that was one reason. And the other thing that I found very quickly was that, again, not surprisingly, when people were transcribing to use the texts in books that they were writing, they tended to transcribe the bits that were easiest to read. And where you came to something that was nigh on impossible, they would kind of not use that bit. And what I began to discover fairly quickly, as we gradually got better at transcribing, was that when you started to really get into the bits of the letters and the diaries and other documents that hadn't been used before, some incredibly exciting information began to come through, and a much stronger picture of Georgiana as a person as well. One example is this one, which is in the book, and this was just a tiny little piece of paper in Carlisle, in the north of England, in the archive there, in the papers belonging to her father. And I hadn't really looked at it before. I don't actually think anybody else had ever looked at it, since it had been put there in, 1860, when her mother's papers were archived there. And it was a little tiny document, and it was actually the earliest evidence that I found of anything that connected Georgiana with anything to do with plants. And it was when she was 3 years old, and it was at Crosby Lodge, the house I showed you earlier, and her father had finished building the house and having all the plantations and the trees put in, and he had a ceremonial tree planting. we sort of do the same at home. If somebody comes to stay, we ask them to plant a tree. And he had everybody in the family and all the best friends, everybody planted a tree. And Georgiana Kennedy planted a balm of Gilead when she was 3 years old. A balm of Gilead apparently has, or was thought to have, extremely strong medicinal properties. And there's another story about that, but I'll have to resist telling you, otherwise I'll run out of time. One of the other difficulties I had with choices to do with the writing of the book was how to tell the story. It actually took me about 2 years to work out how on earth I was going to try and write this story as a book that would make sense and make it some kind of interesting read. It's a very tragic story. You know, when you write fiction, I'm sure that you can create the storyline, you can plan the story arc, you can think, this is the way I want my main character's life to go. But with Georgiana's life, it was there. The facts were there in order. And there were places where, frankly, what I needed to say was, and for the next 10 years, it was awful. It was more of the same. She went on starving. More children died. It was tragic. So it was quite difficult to work out how to do that and make it bearable for somebody to read. Another difficult decision was to do with all the visual things that I wanted to include. I don't know whether I'm just a visual person, but the feedback that I'm getting is that people do really enjoy the images in the book. But when I came up with my short list for the pictures that I wanted in the book, there were about 100. We've ended up with more than 90, which maybe it is overkill, but I guess self-publishing means that you can make decisions like, I want 90 pictures in my book, and I'm going to do that. So the visual things were very important to me. The visual things, I think, are a way of sharing with readers things that you don't necessarily feel you can describe to the same kind of level just by using words. Sometimes words aren't enough. So the pictures really helped out with that. A couple of things about the decisions to do with the pictures, and they're all a bit different. This was a picture I would have loved to use in the book, because when I was trying to describe the house that Georgiana grew up in, Crosby Lodge, and I was saying in the book that it was actually much smaller than it is now, and it's quite difficult to imagine how small the house was. It was pretty posh and pretty imposing, but this picture shows very clearly, if you look at the sort of curved window in the middle, and the two long windows next to it, that was the extent of the house when Georgiana lived there. There were the two wings at the back and a little bit behind, but that was all. And I decided in the end that I would not use this picture in the book because it was a family picture. And at the time of the publication of the book, the family was still living there. And I think there's something a bit not quite right about publishing in a book a picture that looks down onto a family's home in that way. So I decided not to include that picture. This one did make it into the book. This is the Acacia extensor, and that's my hand. And I really thought very carefully about this one. I maybe shouldn't have put this one in the book, and you might already be thinking why. I'm not wearing gloves. It's very, very, very bad practice. The day we went to Kew Herbarium, and we were shown the specimens, and I said to Mike, can you take a photo? And I'm just going to put my hand. And Mike said to the person who was there, can Bernice touch the specimen? And he said yes. And I said, don't take a photo of my face, because I was sobbing, tears were rolling down. And I decided I would just touch that where her hand would have put it when she placed it. And I shouldn't have put it in the book because it's a demonstration of very poor botanical practice, but it was too important to me in a personal way not to include it. So that one did get in. This one didn't get in, but I wanted to. This is an 1829 wedding dress that I found in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And Georgiana mentioned that she was wearing white, that she wore white wedding ribbons, and she had a white veil when she got married. And I'm pretty sure that this would give us a very, very good idea of the sort of proportions of the dress, where the waist was gradually moving down from the high empire line, but not yet at the very low, tight waistline that came with the big crinolines. But I didn't include it because historically that would have been a sin, that would have been assumption. So I'm glad to share it with you now, but it didn't make it into the book. This one didn't make it into the book. It's a letter from her sister Mary, and I wanted to include it because to me it's a very visually beautiful example of one of the reasons why I'm just fascinated with reading old documents. There's something very beautiful about them and challenging, but I decided not to include it. It's also the only letter I found that has a stamp on it, so I think it's a penny black, but you might know better than I did. And the last one, before I come to the things that I want to finish with, this is, I can hear music. It's okay. I couldn't work that one out. I was thinking we have got some animation with music, but not yet. This is a family portrait, and there's the story that goes with this is actually a little bit lengthy, but I'll try and summarize. This picture is in the book, but it only made it by the skin of its teeth. I think it was about 5 days before we said to the printers, print. And there are 3 family portraits of the 3 Kennedy sisters, Mary, Eliza, and Georgiana, and nobody has ever known in the family which one was which. And to cut a very long story short, the letter I showed you previously from her sister Mary, when I went back to it and decided that I would transcribe her sister's letters, there was a clue. I mean, I'd seen the letter 7 years earlier. It had been there all the time, but when I finally went back to it and bothered to read the whole thing, there was a clue that proved, by a rather circuitous route, which one of the portraits was actually Georgiana. And I now know that this is Georgiana, and I'm so pleased because it's definitely the prettiest one, and it's the one holding the flowers. So that one literally got in by the skin of its teeth before we said, okay, print to the printers. So I'll finish, we'll leave little Georgiana with her blue eyes looking down at us, and I'll just say a few things about self-publishing and then finish with something quick that I hope you'll enjoy. I think I can only talk about our experience of self-publishing because I'm sure that wouldn't be right for everybody, it wouldn't be the same for everybody, but I can tell you some of the main things. I thought, how can I talk about self-publishing in about 7 minutes? But I'll do my best. I think unless you happen to be wealthy and hugely confident, taking the decision to self-publish is quite a terrifying thing. And it probably should be, because you really do need to think very carefully about some of the decisions. I don't think it's something that would be good to just decide on very lightly. Unless it doesn't really matter to you if you spend some money and it just disappears. So the first things really for us were, the first thing was really why I wanted to publish the book. And I would say be very sure what your reasons are, what it is that you're trying to do with the book. And for me, the absolute overriding thing was that I'd found that previous biographies didn't really portray Georgiana in the way that as the person that I really believed she was. I thought she was really quite different from some of the descriptions in biographies that I'd read before. And there was a lot of factual information about Georgiana and about John Molloy that was frankly incorrect. And I wanted the true story to get to as many people as possible. I had mountains and mountains of information. And I thought, if something happened to me, that story has gone again. All that finding out has disappeared once again. So that was my overall aim. The first thing we did, because Mike and I worked together on the publishing, we did a joint effort. And the first thing we did, because we're not hugely wealthy people, is we decided on the budget. And we decided how much money we could lose if nobody bought the book. We didn't want to destroy our lives financially, so it was extremely important, and we stuck to it. And we had spreadsheets, and we worked out how we could manage to work within that budget. We had certain priorities that we started with. We had the non-negotiables. So one was, for example, we wanted to print in WA. That was really important. We could have done things much more cheaply if we'd printed in another country, but we wanted to print in WA. There were certain things to do with quality that were non-negotiable. There were certain things to do with colour pictures that were non-negotiable. The number of pictures was always up for grabs. But we worked out how much we wanted the book to sell for, and within that it was a bit of a kind of sliding block puzzle, what we were able to do without going over the top of our budget, and we were determined not to go over our budget. One of the important things that I wanted to do was to have an editor, because I've done a lot of editing work in the past, but it's always been in education, and I'm okay as an editor, but I knew enough to know that as a writer, if you're really serious, and it's a considerable, the size of the manuscript is considerable, you do need an editor. And I spent quite a lot of time finding the best editor, researching, finding the best editor that I could, the best editor I could afford, and I was very lucky. Glenda Downing worked with me, and she did a fantastic job. And I knew immediately when she came back to me and said, this, and this, I would never have thought of those things. So it's an external voice, it's not one of your friends, and it's someone who really knows their job. Same thing with a proofreader. I've done proofreading, but a proofreader does a job that really I could not have done. There were things along the way. We got to the point where everything was ready to go to the printer. There was one more thing we needed to do, and that was the maps. There were a few maps in the book just to kind of help people with the basic geography of where everything is, particularly in the UK. And I'd found a cartographer, and I had this idea that I wanted the maps to have that kind of hand-drawn look, which would be fitting with the style of the book. And Mike said, we've reached the top of our budget. So I said, okay. We looked at the non-negotiables, and there was no money to do the maps. And Mike said, I'll do the maps. And I said, how are you going to do that? And he said, I'll learn. So we really worked very hard to keep everything within the budget, and that was one of the things where we had to make some different decisions. It was really, I think, about being very honest with ourselves about our own skills. But between us, we've got some skills and a lot of experience in things to do with publishing, to do with layout, to do with design, but knowing what our limitations were and where we really did need the help of an expert. And that just brings me really to the last thing I want to say before we come to that little ending thing I was mentioning, and that was really to do with the cover. And we could have done a cover ourselves, but we decided that we needed an expert for the cover. And the designer who came up with this cover was Lauren Wilhelm. And I just want to share with you, because not many people, in fact, last night was the first group of people, the guides at Kings Park, that I showed the next slide to. So you're the second group of people. This is the portrait that the cover came from. Lauren Wilhelm painted a portrait after she finished reading the manuscript, and the face that you see is the face from this portrait. It looks a bit odd because it was where we were trying the frame out at the framers, but that's the face. And then the other image on the cover is the silhouette of the plant is one of Georgiana's specimens from Kew Herbarium. It's the one over on the right, and it's Boronia dichotoma, and that's the sort of silhouette that the face comes through. So I just want to show you one more thing, and then we'll have, I think, 10 minutes maybe or so for questions. And this is actually the only other group that have seen what I'm going to show you now is the U3A group in Margaret River. I've done a couple of talks for them on Georgiana. They've asked for a third one, so we're going back to do number 3, I think, just after Christmas. And I showed this to them a few weeks ago. In Georgiana's 1829 diary, it has printed pages, as diaries often do, journals do. And in that diary, there is, in the Batty Library, a little piece of music called the Hope Waltz. And Georgiana was quite an accomplished pianist. And she had a little wind-operated piano organ that she used to take out onto the grass by the river in Augusta, and she would play it in the evenings. and play music to the children. And this little piece of music was written to be in this diary. It's not a published piece of music. And I'd often wanted to hear it, but I don't play the piano myself. It actually took me 7 years before I managed to get round to getting into a room with someone who played the piano with the music to play it for me. And I found it very moving because I'm sure you've had the experience where you hear a piece of music from the past and it just transports you back to that time, a childhood song or something from your teenage years or the first dance with somebody, or I don't know. But I heard that piece of music and it was one of those moments, of which there have been a few, where I felt a direct connection between the present and the past. It was very special. And fortunately, Mike was there videoing. So this is the piece of music. And this is, you can hear it now, Georgiana's Hope Waltz. I hope. It always makes me cry. So, we can have some questions. Are we going to need a mic for people to ask questions, or? The music isn't, no, not the piece of music, no. If you especially want a copy of the photo, I can send it to you. I'll talk to you afterwards about how I can. And then are you a pianist? Oh, dear. Might need a tissue. It always gets me, isn't it funny, after all this time?
Questions?
I'm really interested in the self-publishing side of things. Can you tell us how you distributed the book and got it out there, and kind of how far you got it out? So is it just in Perth? Is it just in Margaret River?
Good question.
Is it in Western Australia? Is it in Australia? Or is it out in the world?
Yes, thank you. Good question. If I'd worn my glasses all the time and looked at my notes, I would have said that, because it is in my notes. One of the things I wanted to say was that we have a distributor in Western Australia, and that single thing has been one of the most helpful things. We actually do the distribution ourselves in the Capes region, so we visit the bookshops and distribute there simply because it's fairly easy for us and we can get there quickly. But we were extremely lucky to be taken on by a distributor who lives in this region, and she is an experienced distributor. She distributes other books, and she does that job for us, and we're absolutely sure that that's one of the reasons that's helped with the very good sales that we've had. And I don't know anything about e-publishing or publishing with Amazon, or I only know about this book and publishing, a hard copy book. And that was an extremely good decision for us, and we're very glad that she said yes. And the book is, she distributes in WA. We actually haven't done anything about marketing to the rest of Australia yet. We have, I think there are 6 outlets, 6 shops in the rest of Australia, mainly places like the bookshops in the Botanic Gardens and some libraries. We get a few requests from the UK, from the United States, from over east, and basically send books. Unfortunately, I wrote a very heavy book. I like to say I wrote it heavy so you could use it for pressing flowers, so it was botanically useful, but it cost as much to send the book almost as it does to buy a copy. So I probably should have written a lighter book. But yes, distributor, and at the moment only in WA, really. Good question.
Is it asking too much who the distributor is, please? Because my daughter-in-law's published a book and we don't know where to get it.
Well, she doesn't usually take on more titles. Does it? If you look on my website, georgianamolloy.com, no AU. There's another georgianamolloy.com.au. Mine doesn't have the AU. georgianamolloy.com. If you look on there, it'll tell you who the distributor is. There's a question just started down here without the mic.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, just briefly, was the fact that there were other books about Georgiana, and I have one on my shelf at home, that you weren't particularly fussed about. You didn't say fussed, but that's like Sarah.
Yes. That wouldn't be true, that I didn't enjoy them and I didn't think they were great biographies. The previous two biographers, Antonia Hasluck wrote the book that is now with Fremantle Press Penguin in 1955, and she didn't have access to any of Georgiana's papers that are actually in Cumbria in the UK. She only had what's here today in the Batty Library. And then William Lynes wrote his novel about 21 years ago, and he had access to the UK things. But neither of those writers had access to the kind of online resources that I've been able to use for searching. So I think they're both terrific books, and I think in particular, Antonia Hasluck, if she hadn't, first of all, looked at those letters that were held by the Royal Western Australian Historical Society, if she hadn't looked at those and thought, I need to write a book about that, I think we might not even know as much about Georgiana as we do today. She was the first person to realise that there was a wonderful story there. The issue for me was that neither of the previous biographers actually, the simplest thing is to say that they both really interpreted her as a fanatically religious, over-pious woman. I think one of them said she ran away from her family because they weren't religious enough for her. And what I found as I started to do the research was that that was not the case at all. There was much more to it. Georgiana wasn't any more religious than any of the other young women in her circle. So there were things that were wrong, and I thought that both Georgiana and John Molloy weren't being portrayed. You know, when you talk to people in the street and you say Georgiana, and they say, oh yes, she was that religious, very religious. And that wasn't true. So I wanted the full picture and the true picture to be out there. And both of them also, they said a little bit about her early life, but really no more than about a page. And I think in my book, probably, I don't know, about the first 150 pages. I thought the first 24 years of her life were important because they shaped her, and that's where the values came from that helped to make her into the person that we know of today. So it wasn't a case of not liking the books. I felt that they, for all sorts of practical reasons, had missed out on important material. Question?
I wanted to go back just briefly to the woman who asked about where to buy the book from. I'm Deirdre Robb from writingWA, and we've also partnered to put this event on. Now, we were so delighted when we discovered Bernice's book and read it and thought, oh my goodness, can this really be a self-published book? And now to hear the full story behind it. So what we've done is we've incorporated this book into our ongoing program. It's going to be our book of the month. There will be book club notes for it published on writingWA's website. Last week we interviewed Bernice, and we have a TV program called Cover to Cover that goes out on a regional TV satellite station, and that will also be loaded onto our website so you can see that. Also, as part of that program, we have a partnership with Crow Books in Perth, because we realise that in regional centres it is very difficult sometimes to buy books. Here in Mandurah we've just had our one bookshop closed down. Crow Books, in partnership with writingWA, will supply all the wonderful books that we've featured in our programs. Just Google Crow Books. I can't tell you their phone number right now. You can phone them, say that you heard about the book in whatever way you want to, and they will post it out to you, bill you online. All I had to say, but yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to know when you became interested in Georgiana and what was it that captured your interest?
Well, there's quite a long story about that in the book, but I'll try and summarise. I live just a few kilometres north of Augusta, and to begin with, it's quite difficult to live in that region and not know a bit about Georgiana Molloy because of the names of places and the school. And I knew a little bit about her. I'd heard that she was very prim and she was religious and she was a botanist. I'm very interested in history. It was part of what I studied. And I'd studied 18th and 19th century literature, and it was quite a passion of mine. And one of the first things that happened was that I heard that the little collection of books that she brought with her to Western Australia on the ship had been donated by a family member, and they were in the Royal Western Australian Historical Society. I also read the William Lyons biography. And when I looked at the collection of books that she'd brought with her, the first thing that I realized was that although there were the obvious things like the Bible and the history of truth and things like that, there were a couple of books in that collection that should not have been in the collection of someone who was an extremely religious. I heard she was Presbyterian, she was fanatically pious, and the books that she had with her were they would have been considered bawdy. They were risky, they were pretty tricky stuff at that time. And that began to sort of make me think that there was something that was maybe not quite right. Maybe there was more to this woman than I'd been thinking. So to begin with, it was a mystery. And then as I just, casually searching online and looking at things, I began to realize that there was far more to her. One of the next things I did was we were working up in Perth and I had an afternoon, and I went to the Batty Library and got Georgiana's 1829 diary on microfilm, and I was sitting there, and one of the first things I saw was her diary entry for the day after the wedding. So the morning after she had married John Molloy. And the entry for that morning after the wedding night says, "What a night this was." And then 5 exclamation marks. And when you're looking at a document like that, when somebody is writing with a quill pen or a metal nibbed pen of that type, when they're pressing into the paper, you can tell. And I'm thinking, this isn't a prudish woman. This is a warm-blooded, she's like, I can remember sitting in the Batty Library looking at this and sort of looking around at who I could tell, and there was nobody there. And I actually had tears rolling down my cheeks at that point. There were also very personal things, and I think people who read the book do read between the lines a bit and realize that there were very strong connections in my own life, not just the obvious ones. I had come to Western Australia with a suitcase, and in my suitcase were the most precious books and things that I had with me, because they tell you a lot about someone. A person's book collection tells you a lot about them. And there were things to do with childhood as well, family, that were very, very personal connections. So there was a lot of personal, emotive stuff going on during the writing of the book as well.
On, isn't it? Switched on. Hi, Bernice. I'm Jo Krabish, coordinator of the U3A. I'm fairly new to Western Australia. We moved over here in 1996, so I'm just a newcomer. We've travelled around quite a bit, and we spent quite a bit of time in Augusta because we play croquet down there. And the only time I've ever come across anything to do with Georgiana Molloy was to stay in a motel down there with her name on the outside. Quite a nice motel. Now, my question is, I'm wondering how much, albeit posthumously, how much public recognition has been bestowed on Georgiana? Is there anything at all that says to people passing through who she is, what she was, who she was, what she did, and so forth.
You mean in Augusta?
In Western Australia and in Augusta, yes.
Well, there are a few things that look as if they're going to be happening at the moment. There's some talk of new names for Western Australian, are they political regions or, sorry, electoral regions. And there's some talk about naming one of them Molloy. So there are a few things going on. I heard the other day about a school over east, I think in Sydney, where they're going to do some naming to do with Georgiana Molloy. There is a plant, Bernice Molloy, which has now been named after her. She didn't have a species named after her during her lifetime. She did actually get some recognition during her lifetime because she was quoted and had some very nice things said about her in botanical and gardening magazines of the time. And we know that she saw those before she died. So she was aware that people were reading about her back in Britain and in the newspapers in Perth and that kind of thing. So she did know, but she didn't get the kind of recognition that other male collectors were getting in her lifetime. There was a very well-known and still a very famous article published in the gardening world by Professor Lindley, one of the most famous botanists of the time, and he thanked various people who had done some collecting, but he didn't actually include Georgiana Molloy's name in his thanks, and hers was one of the major collections that had contributed to that. But it wasn't just her. You know, if you were a woman, you didn't really get much of a look in the naming of species at that time. But there is a very beautiful, tall, pink Boronia named after her now. It's actually quite difficult to grow. It's very delicate. We've got 2 left in the garden. We did have 4, and you have to keep the roots very wet. But yes, no, not a lot of recognition, but things are beginning to happen now, I think. There must be one more.
One more? One more?
Georgiana Molloy's school. Yes. They invited me to go along a few weeks back, and I met the principal and some of the staff and talked to them about Georgiana. And hopefully I'm going to go back after Christmas and sort of help the staff to reconnect in maybe a closer way with their can't think of the right word. Sorry? Patron is the word, yes. Yeah. It is a beautiful school. It's a beautiful school, yeah. That's why I bring him. It's very funny. I'll just tell you one maybe final story. Last night I did a talk for the guides at the Kings Park guides at the Botanic Gardens, and I was telling them one thing where I was saying John Molloy was so very supportive to Georgiana. He was incredibly modern. You know, he was the government official. He was so important, and he was an officer, and it was the 1830s. But he would make toast for her and take it in bed so she didn't have to get up early occasionally. And he was very understanding. He'd go out with her collecting. He did quite a lot of collecting on her behalf. And he wrote on one occasion, because she obviously didn't do all the domestic jobs that she should sometimes, when she was botanizing. And he wrote in a letter once, often do I go in a buttonless shirt and complain, oh, when will Captain Mangle's seeds be sown? And I said to them last night, my husband says exactly the same thing very often, and then I looked and realized he was wearing a shirt with poppers, and I said, he buys shirts with poppers now. But anyway, no, John Molloy was an incredible man. She was 37. Yes, born in 1805, died in 1843. 37. Not an unusual life story for settler women of that time.
Yes, I've forgotten what ship she came over on.
It was the Warrior.
The Warrior. Okay, thank you.
Yes. I didn't, no, but it's a bit of a long story. In fact, one of the things I thought really that was missing a little bit maybe from previous books was that there was a whole historical background about why, not just the Molloys, but why people like them came to be colonists at that time. And it was a large, well, I mean, there's a whole history of generations behind it. But a lot of it was to do with the fact that the Napoleonic Wars had fairly recently finished, and people had been fighting for a new world, a better life, but nothing had changed. And not only that, thousands of soldiers had returned home after something like, I don't know, I can't remember, maybe 15 years of fighting against the French. And soldiers had come home maimed, mentally damaged, and they came back and the price of bread had still gone up. People were still starving. And there was increased mechanization. The Industrial Revolution had boomed. The jobs that used to be available when these men went away to war, jobs in the countryside, on the farms, those jobs were gradually disappearing with the enclosures. Everyone was moving into the cities. And suddenly, there was this opportunity that was being advertised in the newspapers daily of this place on the other side of the world where it was warm and sunny. There was incredible fertile land. Nobody owned it. No, there was nobody there. You could just go and take it. And all you needed was, well, to some people it was an impossible amount of money, but it was a relatively small amount of money to go and get a grant of land. And then if you met the conditions of the grant, which was basically to farm it for a certain amount of time, then you got to keep the land. And even if you were very poor, you could hook up with some settlers and go as their indentured servants, and you could arrive in Western Australia, and in theory, when you had worked through your indenture, which I think was usually 6 or 7 years, and sometimes less than that because you could get let out of your indentures, you could actually end up from being, the girl who cleaned the grates in the upstairs, downstairs kind of house. You could end up as a landowner yourself in 7 years with a small plot of land, and it could change your life. So it was a dream of a better world, really. And for some people, desperation of getting away from the life that they knew. So that was the short answer.
We've actually, our U3A kind of group is in Norfolk Island.
All right.
And the story is quite parallel.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, just one last thing. Not to bring on any more tears, but would it be possible to hear that beautiful piece of music again to finish up with? Because it was just really enchanting.
Mike can do that too. I would have had to say no. I've got no idea, but we'll have this as the end, shall we? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bernice, for such a wonderful, inspiring talk and overview of your book. Must thank you very much to writingWA for bringing this wonderful event to us and the whole Writers on the Road series. Further acknowledge Bernie Worthington and Drakesbrook Wines for the taste of his glorious wines out in the foyer. The bar will still be open. The books, Bernice's book, is available for purchase. And I'm very much hoping that Bernice will be out there and able to sign and discuss that book with you. Thank you so much for coming and making this such a wonderful, successful event. Thanks very much.